April 4th, 1968. Hundreds of thousands of Muscovites line the streets to accompany Yuri Gagarin's ashes to the Kremlin. Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin, cosmonaut number 1. The first to escape the Earth's gravity 7 years earlier. Gagarin is dead, and all of Russia is left silent and breathless. The Soviets are mourning for more than their lost hero. With Gagarin, Russia's dream of dominating space is being buried too.
Дорогие друзья, близкие и незнакомые, соотечественники, люди всех стран и континентов, через несколько минут могучий космический корабль унесет меня в далекие просторы Вселенной. Что можно сказать вам в эти последние минуты перед стартом? Вся моя жизнь кажется мне сейчас одним прекрасным мгновением. Все, что прожито, что сделано прежде, было прожито и сделано ради этой минуты.
April 12, 1961. Yuri Gagarin, a young Soviet fighter pilot aged 27, has just been propelled into space to journey around the planet before returning safely home to Russia. For the first time, a human being can gaze upon the entire Earth at once. Nothing will ever be the same again. The universe is opening up to man, and in the midst of the Cold War, the Soviet Union has just taken a decisive lead over America in the space race. Yuri Gagarin will never see a man walk on the moon. Indeed, he will never leave the Earth again. His epoch-making space odyssey will have lasted just 1 hour and 48 minutes. An icon in a land of icons, he embodies for the whole world the new Soviet man, born out of socialist science and historical materialism, the living symbol of a communism triumphant. He is the first, sing the children at every school in the empire. 7 years after his dramatic orbit, it is during a routine flight aboard a fighter plane that the world's first cosmonaut disappears. On this March 28, 1968, a leaden grey sky blankets the military airbase at Shlakov near Moscow. Gagarin is to carry out a control flight accompanied by a Red Army instructor. A few simple exercises are programmed in the flight plan: turns and sweeps, a nosedive. 21 minutes in the air before returning to base. At 10:19, Yuri Gagarin takes off. He announces over the radio that he is heading for the aerial exercises flight zone. On his radar screen, the flight controller at the Shlakov airbase monitors the aircraft's trajectory.
В это время On that day, I was running some parachute jump exercises with a group of cosmonauts at an aerodrome close to the launch zone. The weather suddenly got worse, got pretty bad. It started raining and snowing at the same time. I gave the order to stop the exercise and stayed for a moment with my comrades next to the control tower. It was at that moment that we heard two very powerful detonations. The first was obviously an explosion, and the second could well have been another explosion or an aircraft breaking the sound barrier.
Или же самолет перешел в сверхзвук.
What Alexei Leonov doesn't know is that after just 11 minutes in the air, Gagarin has contacted the control tower again to ask for permission to return to base. At 10:30, the flight director gives him the all clear. He hears Gagarin reply, "Understood, I'm going ahead." And then, nothing. 55 seconds later, the plane disappears from the radar screens.
Gagarin's emergency code was 725, and mine was 625. The controller was constantly calling on the radio with 725. Eventually, I thought it was me he was calling, so I asked him, "Is that for me or not?" And he replied, "No, it's not for you." When I got back to base, the unit's technical director came up to me and said that Gagarin's plane had already been out of fuel for 45 minutes, and he still hadn't returned. And so I had the awful thought that the explosion I had heard was Yuri Gagarin's aircraft. Nobody dared admit it, but I had heard. We had all heard the explosions. A helicopter was sent out, and after a quarter of an hour, it reported a column of black smoke and steam. That's how the glorious career of this extraordinary man came to an end. Yuri Gagarin.
Юрия Гагарина.
Why does a simple, routine 20-minute flight aboard a tested and reliable plane in normal weather conditions suddenly become a catastrophe? Despite several months of investigation and a report stretching to 29 volumes, the Kremlin-designated commission inquiring into the death of cosmonaut number 1 will never render a definitive conclusion. Gagarin's death officially remains an unfortunate accident, an enigma. Yuri Gagarin is 34 years old when his plane, a MiG-15, used as a training craft by the Red Army, crashes to Earth. Paradoxically, history's first cosmonaut is finally completing his training as a fighter pilot, interrupted 8 years previously with his induction into the space program. In total, including his final flight, Yuri Gagarin has flown just 340 hours and 15 minutes since his maiden flight at the Saratov Aero Club in 1957. Saratov, on the Volga, where Red Army recruitment officers first spot a young Yuri in 1955. The Aero Club is open to all youngsters, run by the Komsomol, the Young Communists organization. It is a nursery for young pilots trained on old Army Yak-18s by Soviet fighter veterans. Gagarin signs up at the club as soon as he arrives in town, a year earlier, where he is to take his foundryman's diploma. Like all young Russians at the time, he has grown up inspired by tales of the heroic exploits of Red Army flying aces during the Great War of Liberation. As a child in the village of Klushino, 200 kilometers west of Moscow, he witnessed such aerial combats for himself.
Klushino was occupied on October 12, 1944, and this story took place shortly before the fascists invaded the village. There was an aerial combat over the village, and the fascist planes had shot down one of ours. The pilot managed to land not far from Kluchino. A second plane came to assist it and landed next to the first one. And of course, all the kids, everyone, including Yuri and his brother Valentin, rushed over there towards the two aviators. Everyone took something to eat or drink for the pilots, whatever the kids had found at home, bread, ham, milk. For the children, the aviators were real heroes. Of course, this story was central to Yuri's memories of his childhood. The solidarity between the two pilots, between one soldier and another who came to help him. It was a story that marked Yuri, and he often told it throughout his life.
He liked physics a lot. His teacher in 6th grade was called Lev Mikhalich, and he had been a pilot in the war. He spent a lot of time with his students, and he would have them make, model aircrafts. He talked about aviation a lot, and so even then, Yuri wanted to be a pilot. One day, at primary school, Yuri made a paper aeroplane and threw it in class. As the window was open, it flew outside and landed on the head or shoulder of someone passing by. They began shouting, complaining that children were being allowed to throw planes out of the window. So Yuri and his teacher had to go outside to apologize. You see, even in primary school, he was already dreaming of becoming a pilot.
But during these post-war years, the young Yuri, or Yurashka, as he is affectionately known, has little time to devote to his dreams of flying. After school, like most of the village children, he helps out at the kolkhoz. Brutal German occupation has left the country ravaged, and as Stalin's reign draws to an end, Russia is often besieged by famine. In the evenings, the family gathers in their wooden ishba around a wood-burning stove to listen to the adults reciting Pushkin, or recounting once more their tales of courage and daring during the war or the revolution. It is a rustic, age-old life, probably as harsh as in the days of Yuri's mujik ancestors before the revolution. But the Gagarins are patriots and staunch communists. They know how to make the best of things. And even at the height of his fame, Gagarin would never miss a chance to return to Klushino and lend a hand at the work farm.
Oh yes, Kluchino was very important to him, and he often went there. How could it have been otherwise? It was his little homeland. He had lived there until 1945, and through the hardest years of his childhood. I mean, the period of Nazi occupation. He'd been there during that. So, of course, the village and the people were very special to him.
Gagarin,
For me, Gagarin was, how should I put it? He was a very good friend, because our life stories have things in common. We were born into ordinary families, him into a family of peasants, and me with laborers. Both of us lived through the Nazi occupation during World War II. I spent 900 days under the occupation, and so did Gagarin.
We were the same age. Our childhood was right in the middle of the Second World War. And with all the difficulties that situation created during his childhood, his schooling was by no means simple right up to 6th grade. When he arrived in college, he was years behind. Then he went to the professional trade school in Lubertsy near Moscow. And he studied to be a foundryman, to become a highly qualified worker. And in that context, in those conditions, it certainly wasn't easy.
At the age of 17, Gagarin joins the metallurgy school in Saratov. Metal workers are the aristocrats of Russian labor, heroes of reconstruction, at the heart of the myth of the new Soviet man. Choosing metallurgy is almost like joining the army. At the end of 1955, he has his foundryman's diploma in his pocket, along with his amateur pilot's license. He's offered the chance to either enter engineering school or become a fighter pilot. He goes for his wings and a uniform. His fate is sealed. Yuri Gagarin will be a flyer in the service of the Soviet homeland. In 1955, the conquest of space is already a big issue. The emergence of jet planes at the end of the war has opened up new possibilities for aviation, and space is now just a small step away. The Americans have understood what's at stake and have discreetly obtained the services of Wernher von Braun, the man responsible for the Nazis' lethal V-1 and V-2 rockets. Space is still but a dream, but is already a military prerogative. Soviet Russia needs a champion, an engineer to match von Braun, in order not to fall behind. Their man of the moment will be Sergei Pavlovich Korolev.
He had a perfect combination, I would even say it was extraordinary, of wisdom and intelligence. That kind of person is only born once a century, and for the moment in the 21st century, we haven't seen the like of Korolev.
Korolev was one of the obsessive aviation pioneers who from the 1920s contributed to Russia's powerful aeronautics industry. In the 30s, he imagined gliding rockets capable of taking men into space, even as far as the moon. But in 1938, suspected of being a Trotskyist supporter, he was arrested and deported to Siberia. He would survive thanks to the war. In 1942, Stalin decided the Russian war effort could not ignore a brain like Korolev's. He ended the war as a colonel, working on developing new weapon systems in an office located inside a military prison. Rehabilitated after Stalin's death, he would continue to be forbidden from appearing in public throughout his life. From the early 50s, he worked in secret, perfecting a space launch craft, the Semyorka rocket, the same machine that before long would send Gagarin into space. In 1957, he provided Russia with its first victory in the battle to dominate space exploration, with the launch of Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. Sputnik literally means companion and included Korolev's initials, SP, for Sergei Pavlovich, and yet his name would never appear in official Kremlin bulletins.
As the French say, c'est la vie. At the time, everything was kept secret, and there was only a very select group who knew Korolev. A few scientists and the people who worked with him directly. But at the same time, the Americans didn't broadcast the presence of Wernher von Braun either. On the contrary, they even wanted to conceal the fact that the German was working with them. It was a time of the Cold War, you understand, back then, and the two sides were trying to outdo each other. There was the arms race and the race between the two sides to get into space. That was why everything was so secret.
After Sputnik, the next objective is manned spaceflight. Korolev now has the attention of Khrushchev. He manages to convince him that the USSR's advance must be maintained at all costs, and the Americans are preparing to send a man into space. Can they be given a head start? Khrushchev agrees his chief engineer has a valid point and orders that a unit of Soviet cosmos explorers be set up, the first cosmonauts.
The recommendation of the chief designer, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, was to select the first cosmonaut from among the fighter pilots. During 6 months in 1959, future candidates were selected from different regiments and different divisions. And then, On October 4th, the shortlisted candidates were called in.
200 men from among thousands of volunteers are summoned to a Moscow military hospital to undergo final tests. All of them are less than 1.70 meters tall and weigh less than 70 kilos. All are in excellent physical condition, and they all have an irreproachable political background. Good Soviets, patriots, and Communist Party members. Among their number is one Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin, 1.59 meters, 57 kilos. He has been getting bored at the Murmansk Air Force Base, waiting to complete his final flight hours, which will bring him at last his qualification as a fighter pilot.
Among all the future cosmonauts brought together for that medical exam, and even among those who weren't selected, I was the first to meet Gagarin. It was on October 7th, 1959. What can I say? He arrived. He looked like an ordinary pilot. He was polite and friendly. You could see right away that he was sociable, because any other guy would have just walked in. But Gagarin introduced himself right away. We got acquainted, and he left me with a favorable impression, that of a real pilot in the Soviet Air Force.
At the time, everything was secret. And so, when you were walking around the hospital and you saw a perfectly healthy young man, you were thinking, what on earth is he doing here? He must be here for the same reason as me, for a medical exam. We would put it like that, for the same reason. And so we'd go up to one another quite discreetly and ask, for the same reason? And they would say, yes, okay, understood. And it would mean he was a colleague, a friend.
He was bare-chested. His pajamas were hanging over the back of the chair. He was reading something. He lifted his head and looked at me. And what struck me right away were his blue eyes. Incredibly blue. It was as if they were radiating blueness all around him.
I met Yuri quite simply, rather by chance. It was on a bus, a little green bus. It was in 1960. We didn't know our destination. Out of the 3,500 young fighter pilots pre-selected to be candidates for the first detachment of cosmonauts, there were only 20 of us left.
20 men who do not know what lies ahead. 20 young men who know that the first Russian in space is probably in their group. But which one and when? The first Sputnik was launched 2 years ago, and since then only 2 more capsules have been put into orbit by the USSR. In one of the capsules was a dog, Laika, the first living being to be sent into space, but not to be returned. Russian scientists didn't know how to do that. So it would appear that manned spaceflight is still a long way off.
We would speculate a lot, and there were a lot of stories surrounding Korolev. We'd never seen him before the meeting at the Aeronautical Medical Academy. It was maybe early September or late August 1960. We were all summoned there, all the future cosmonauts. And obviously, we were all a little tense.
We had all imagined that this giant would walk in, like over 6 feet tall, a very imposing man. And suddenly, the door opens, and this average-sized guy comes in, with a big head and broad forehead, and lively eyes that were a bit wrinkled.
When he came into the classroom, he looked at us and smiled and said, "Sit down, my little eagles." And he started talking to us, each in turn.
лист бумаги.
He said, "Do you think the head of construction has dropped by just for a chat, and that you won't be going into space in 2, 3, or even 5 years? Well, I promise you today, and this is in 1960, that one of you will be in space within a year."
The aspiring cosmonauts are subjected to a merciless training program and rigorous discipline, watched over by Sergei Korolev. And until the end, Korolev keeps the suspense alive. The name of the future hero will only be revealed on April 8th, 1961, just 4 days before the big day.
Такое решение нужно было принять, и командование ВВС рекомендует первым для выполнения космического полета назначить старшего лейтенанта Гагарина Юрия Алексеевича, запасным пилотом назначить Титова Германа Степановича.
Let's look at another aspect of things. Gagarin was Russian. Titov was Russian. Nikolaev was Chuvash. I'm Ukrainian. And Bykovsky, it was hard to say if he was Russian or not. Anyway, there were only Gagarin and Titov who were Russian by birth.
So why Gagarin rather than Titov, whose results are equally impressive? Perhaps because his first name is German, regarded as too Germanic by the Kremlin. Gagarin corresponds perfectly to the image Russia wishes to project. He's a Slav and has the ideal background. Born and raised on a kolkhoz, a foundryman, a survivor of the Nazi invasion, a party member. Free of embarrassing family members with suspicious Trotskyist tendencies, and he was trained in an aero club run by the Komsomol. He also has the backing of Sergei Korolev. Gagarin shares with Korolev an obsession for going to the moon. Korolev appreciates the young man's vitality, his common sense, and his intuitive intelligence. Above all, there is the fact that all his comrades appear to like him. For the man who makes this first journey will be expected on his return to manage and train future cosmonauts.
He never said Korolev, but always repeated, "Our superior who is a father to us." It was the only thing he ever said about him, that their superior was their father. In theory, Sergei Pavlovich had good relations with everybody, but all the cosmonauts emphasized that Gagarin had a special relationship with Korolev. They were closer. Something sometimes clicks between people. There's a kind of magnetic attraction between two people. And there was something like that between them. And I think it was connected to Gagarin's character.
В 9 часов 7 минут по московскому времени я услышал свист и все нарастающий гул. Почувствовал, как гигантский космический корабль задрожал всем своим корпусом и медленно, очень медленно оторвался от стартового устройства.
On his return, Gagarin is instantly a hero. 1.5 million Muscovites line the streets to welcome him home. Comrade Khrushchev embraces him before the cameras. All around the planet, which he was the first ever to see in its entirety, he is a household name. He is awarded a medal as a hero of the Soviet Union and promoted to major.
As certain journalists said, I don't remember in what context, but someone said it, the orbit of our planet has shifted by 3 meters. Why 3 meters? I don't know. But this metaphor demonstrates how the first spaceflight affected the whole world, and the fact that a country that had been so ravaged by the war had been able to accomplish such an important breakthrough in so little time.
Yuri Gagarin travels around the world. Everywhere he presents the same thanks to his Soviet homeland, which is mapped out for me and for all Russians a broad and direct path for our lives. Is this propaganda? Not necessarily. These are optimistic times, and the world is changing. There are wars of liberation in Algeria and Vietnam, the emergence of new brother states for the USSR in Africa, Asia, and above all, Cuba. History is on the march, and Gagarin is convinced he's on the winning side. A sincere communist, he takes on the role as roving diplomat with surprising ease. He visits the world's capitals, mingling with crowds, giving countless interviews. He packs on 5 kilos in 1 year, too much party food. But what does it matter? He is on an important mission, and he's enjoying it. There is a downside, however. He is now too valuable to be allowed to return to space, or even to fly a plane. Gagarin doesn't know it yet, as he wallows in his newfound fame, but his career as a flyer is history.
They decided to protect their first cosmonaut. As they say, aviation is as cruel as war, and that's why they forbade him to fly, to preserve his life. Obviously, it was very hard for him. He suffered from that a great deal.
In 1965, however, he manages to be reinstated on the list of active cosmonauts. 2 years later, he is part of the rescue crew for Soyuz 1, an honorable position on the substitutes bench. The flight ends in catastrophe. Swung out of orbit soon after takeoff, Soyuz 1 crashes in Siberia on re-entering the atmosphere. On board is Vladimir Mikhailovich Komarov, one of 20 cosmonauts from Gagarin's year. The first death in space, and for Yuri, the death of a close friend.
Образ Владимира Михайловича близок и дорог нам, космонавтам. Мы ценим его как человека нового общества, пламенного патриота, офицера-коммуниста, воспитанного Ленинской партией, замечательного товарища и верного боевого друга. Мы всегда будем помнить о тебе, дорогой наш Володя, и достойно продолжать дело, которому ты отдал свою яркую, прекрасную жизнь.
His hopes of more space flights are dashed. Leonid Brezhnev, now the Soviet Supremo, cannot run the risk of letting Gagarin don his spacesuit again. But later the same year, the Kremlin authorizes him to requalify as a fighter pilot, perhaps a kind of consolation.
In 1968, in February, Yuri Gagarin was offered the position as the head of the Cosmonauts Training Center. Yuri Gagarin took the offer very seriously and asked that the appointment be postponed.
Obviously, he was very worried. He insisted. He thought that it was impossible for him to run the flight training center if he himself couldn't fly a plane. He said, "Okay, if going into space is forbidden, at least let me pilot a plane." So he was authorized to fly, but only planes that were considered to be less dangerous, the MiG-15 and MiG-17. These aircrafts had had the fewest accidents, if any, the least dangerous planes. He was authorized, and you can see what happened.
Yuri Gagarin therefore resumes his pilot training where he left off. In November 1967, he again interrupts his training flights to prepare for his aeronautical engineering diploma. Like all cosmonauts, he takes classes at the Zhukovsky Academy in Moscow to become an engineer. This training is imposed by Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. One day, one of them will have to succeed him as head of the space program. They were space adventurers. Now they must become real scientists. Along with his comrades, Gagarin studies physics, astrophysics, fluid mechanics, aerodynamics. To obtain their diploma, they have to design a prototype for a reusable spaceplane, a space shuttle before the term existed.
During our studies at the academy, we would often sit at the same table, and I know he felt a great sense of responsibility concerning his studies. He would always take notes very assiduously, which made revising easier. Of course, he couldn't attend all the classes, but for him, being absent from classes did not justify bad results, so he would be up all night revising. He'd get other people's notes and copy them out, and he had good grades in every exam. He even passed his diploma with distinction.
получил диплом с золотой медалью.
Gagarin presents his thesis on February 17, 1968. At the diploma presentation, all the cosmonauts are present, along with the chief engineers from Star City. All except one. The old man is dead. Taken a month previously following medical complications after a benign operation. The complications were a euphemism. Korolev could have been saved if an artificial respirator had been used in the operating theater. But it was impossible. A broken jaw smashed by Stalin's political police heavies in 1938 prevented the vital tube from entering. History sometimes reserves some macabre jokes. The old scientist now lies at rest within the walls of the Kremlin, finally and officially a hero.
Korolev's death was a terrible blow. It was very hard for us. I think, and this is my own opinion, that if Korolev, like Gagarin, had not died, then Soviet space exploration would have developed rather differently. We could have progressed more rapidly, more dynamically, and not have lost out on the first flight to the moon. It could have been achieved by our own people.
Colonel Gagarin begins his training flights again on March 13, 1968, and in 11 days flies 18 perfect missions. 7 hours in the air, piloting a MiG-15 two-seater alongside his instructor. On March 28th, his final accompanied flight is planned, after which he will have his wings and can fly solo.
В течение марта он летал на самолете.
Throughout the month of March, he had been on flights with his instructor in a MiG-15.
Ему надо было вылететь в сложных условиях самому, чтобы подтвердить.
At the end of training, to obtain his pilot's qualification, it had been decided that he would make his final control flight on March 28th.
После завершения подготовки 28 марта было принято
The control was to be monitored by Seryogin, a test pilot.
Серегин, летчик-испытатель.
He had notably been a test pilot on the MiG-15.
МиГ-15, ути МиГ-15.
Vladimir Seryogin, a living legend in Russian aviation. 4,000 hours, 140 bombing missions over Nazi Germany. A record to impress the most blasé of cosmonauts. Gagarin is in good hands, probably the best. On the fateful morning, Gagarin leaves his apartment in Star City at around 8 o'clock. All the cosmonauts live here, an almost independent compound, a combination of training camp, research center, and comfortable suburb. As he waits for the elevator, Gagarin bumped into the wife of a neighboring colleague, cosmonaut Boris Volynov.
When they came down together, they were chatting and joking around as usual, like good neighbors, like people who are happy. He said to her jokingly, "Your mother's still accompanying you. It's time to grow up." And she must have replied something along the same lines. But after he'd walked a few steps, he said, "You know, I have to go back home. I've forgotten my pass." And she says to him, "Yuri, do you really think they won't let you in?" And he replied, "The rules are the same for everybody." That's what Gagarin was like. And so he went home. We say here that you should never go home when you've forgotten something. It brings bad luck. But at the same time, we don't really believe it.
Gagarin is therefore the last to get on the bus that will take the cosmonaut pilots to the Shlakov base. As the bus starts up, he calls out to the driver, "Paikele, we're off." Just like at the launch of Vostok 1. Everyone laughs. At 8:45, a military doctor carries out a checkup on trainee pilot Gagarin, following Soviet Air Force procedure. When he enters the room where the exam is to take place, Gagarin asks cheekily, "So how's the doctor today?" and pretends to examine him. The doctor notes in his report 64 heartbeats a minute and a breathing rhythm of 10 per minute. Regular statistics, exactly the same as on April 12, 1961, at the Baikonur launch pad. At 10:19, Gagarin takes off. he heads for the flight zone, which in theory is reserved for him alone.
Gagarin carried out the programmed maneuvers. A right turn, a 30-degree left, 45-degree left,
45 градусов. Дальше.
a nosedive,
Горка.
a steep climb.
Пикирование, горка.
The instructor judged that everything was fine
Что все идет отлично.
and that they could return to base.
Надо было вернуться на базу, чтобы захватить вот эту погоду.
It is 10:30 when Gagarin is given permission to return to base, and 10:31 when the plane crashes, traveling at 684 kilometers an hour and digging out a trench more than 2 meters deep. The flight logbook is soon found. A little further away, there is a photograph splattered with blood. It shows Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, Yuri Gagarin's spiritual father. A routine flight, normal weather conditions, an experienced instructor, an aircraft reputed to be the Red Army's safest. The accident which took the life of Yuri Gagarin on a March morning in 1968 is an enigma. A commission of inquiry was set up. The reports piled up, 29 volumes in all, but no conclusions. The crash was inexplicable.
The
official version was that the plane may have been affected by a sudden maneuver to avoid a collision with birds or an aerostat, in which case the aircraft would have been unstable and then crashed, resulting in the death of Yuri and his crew. But the wording of it was very vague.
As a result, rumors abound. It is whispered that Gagarin was drunk at the joystick. But the analyses were categorical. He had not drunk that morning, and in fact he never touched alcohol apart from at festive occasions. Perhaps he committed suicide then, because he hadn't been the first cosmonaut. The real pioneer had landed in China and been held prisoner. Gagarin was sent into space only 2 days later. This rumor had persisted since 1961, when radio hams had claimed to have picked up messages from space before the flight of Vostok 1. But this flight, of course, never happened. At the time, the Soviet Union did not have the technical resources to launch 2 Semyoka rockets just 2 days apart. And yet, the rumors kept coming.
Yes, it's true. Afterwards, the rumors started to fly, like that Gagarin had been committed to a psychiatric hospital. Someone heard one rumor, then passed it along completely changed. And so in the end, you have 1,000 different versions.
Gagarin was not dead. He had been locked up for life in secret in a psychiatric hospital after throwing a glass of champagne in Leonid Brezhnev's face at a Kremlin cocktail party.
No, I think his relations with the authorities were quite normal. In any case, everyone liked him a lot. So when there are rumors that there was a contract on his head, rumors are nothing but rumors. Brezhnev himself loved him, not just Korolev. Everyone loved him.
In fact, the rumor of Gagarin's disgrace was spread by a highly disturbed mythomaniac who also called other cosmonauts pretending to be Gagarin 4 years after his death. There was talk, too, of assassination by either the CIA or the KGB, depending on the version. It was said that Gagarin's MiG-15 struck a UFO that the Kremlin subsequently rebuilt somewhere in Siberia.
There were some very different and sometimes totally absurd versions of what happened to Gagarin. You might have heard about Vanga, some Bulgarian psychic woman, who said that Gagarin was not dead, but that he'd been kidnapped by extraterrestrials, and he's today living comfortably on some other planet somewhere.
It was not until 1985 and Gorbachev's Glasnost that the findings of the Inquiry Commission were finally revealed. Alexei Leonov, a cosmonaut and Gagarin's former comrade, sought to dig up the truth. What Leonov reveals is that Air Force controllers allowed 4 other military aircraft to take off that morning, and that one of them almost collided with Gagarin's MiG-15.
Yes, indeed, there was a plane. Yes, it was flying in this zone. It was a Sukhoi 15. I met 3 peasants who testified at the inquiry. We showed them 3 models of planes separately. The peasants all identified a Sukhoi 15. This plane has a particular configuration, with 2 reactors and an air intake like this, with an interesting shape. They couldn't have mistaken it.
The Sukhoi 15, a prototype for an interceptor, flown at the time by Soviet Air Force test pilots. A winged monster, 3 times bigger than a MiG-15 and twice as fast. We then studied the data recorded by the altimeters. It's clear that this aircraft descended below the clouds. It was criminal behavior. He came down to see what was on the ground, then activated the post-combustion and climbed back up to his initial altitude. At this point, he flew next to Gagarin's plane, a distance of 5 to 10 meters, at a speed more or less equivalent to the speed of sound. The accident can now be explained. The cosmonauts' MiG-15 would have been destabilized by the Sukhoi 15's reactors, and in the thick cloud, the bigger plane would not even have realized it. The result for the older aircraft was a nosedive. In theory, nothing dramatic, as both Gagarin and Seryogin probably thought they had a good kilometer before hitting the ground to straighten out and climb. Except that the MiG's instruments were not always totally reliable, particularly the altimeter, which required a few seconds to adjust in the case of a sudden descent. This deficiency was all the more serious as the control tower's altitude radar was not working that day. When Gagarin hit the ground, he had almost controlled his aircraft. He would have needed just 2 more seconds. Leonov, who was training cosmonauts for parachute jumps that day, a few kilometers from the accident, clearly remembers 2 detonation sounds: the explosion of Gagarin's plane and the noise of a plane breaking the sound barrier. He testified to this effect in writing for the Inquiry Commission's official reports. Almost 20 years later, I consulted this document, and I didn't recognize it. I know my own writing. My report was rewritten. The most essential point was changed. Between the 2 detonations, I had indicated 1.5 to 2 seconds. But the graphics were changed to show a time lapse of between 15 and 20 seconds, which means that the 2 planes would have been 70 kilometers apart. And so the contact was impossible. So I'm asking you, who could have made the corrections? People hoping that there wouldn't be any scandal and that there wouldn't be a guilty party. A sequence of barely believable errors and 17 years of blackout from the Kremlin. Yuri Gagarin, who embodied the best of what the Soviet Union could produce, would finally fall victim to its deficiencies. In the USSR at the time, one Russian joke said that planes could never crash. It would be counter-revolutionary.
You know, there's a wonderful poem by Felix Tchev, The Coffins. It says, "At all times and everywhere in Russia are disorder and negligence that have killed us so many times. And he was no doubt right. It was because the flight was organized with such a disregard for the standards and rules of security that the tragedy occurred.
With Gagarin dead, the Soviet space program lost momentum, leaving the United States free to dominate space. On July 21st, 1969, it was an American voice that declared, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." Yuri Gagarin would not live to accomplish his dream. Neither would he see Red Army tanks rolling into Prague a few months after his death. Times were changing again, and he perhaps no longer had his place. But his smile lives on, fixed on photos with yesterday's colors, which even today hold pride of place in many homes, between two saintly icons. A strange destiny for a man reputed to have said, "God doesn't exist. I didn't see him up there."